Hey, hey, Greg.
How's it going?
It's going good. Do you? I heard some sort of a disturbance for a second.
Did you? Maybe I knocked on something.
Maybe.
I'm excited.
All right. So here we are, and we are to disrupt the Caribbean. Not me personally, but I know that you work in this field academically. Also, you have some heritage and some investment, personal investment in Martinique, I believe.
Yeah,
Uh, huh?
not financial. Sorry.
Not financial.
It's all emotional investment.
That
Yes.
might be a trick of colonialism that it isn't financial. I'm sorry. But anyway, um, welcome to both of us. And Disrupting the Caribbean, we're going to have Zaka, Toto, and Marlene, Daut. And even though we say Caribbean, we really are kind of only going with Francophone. You know, I
Well, the Caribbean is a big place of many, many peoples.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that information.
No, I mean, it's only we could invite 30 people.
Right.
So
Right. So essentially, I think one of the things I was thinking about as we were thinking about our episode today and what to ask our guests and so on is the extent to which, at least for me as a professor, and scholarly work and so on, you know, a place like Martinique, for example, is very much the fuel of like decolonial theory, decolonization theory, but it's always in relation to this very rosy past. We rely on Martinique. We constantly think about Césaire Fanon, even like Paulette Nardal and people like that. But I don't get a sense that there is a lot of thinking done about the Martinican present, the colonial present, if we can even say that. I don't know if you agree or disagree, or I know you work a lot on Haitian studies, though archival. I don't know whether you feel Haiti is similar in the collective imagination. I have a feeling probably not, just given the amount it is in the news, always very negative news. But yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said about this. I was just reading a piece about recent events, the kidnappings in Haiti, by Amy Willens, and she was saying, well, actually, it's not in the news so often. It's only in the news for very specific occasions when the U.S. is somewhat involved or involved in ways that suddenly they find this interesting. Involvement with Haiti, tends to be hidden until the U.S. presents itself as a savior, right? Martinique, I think, that it wouldn't factor in the U.S. is maybe not so surprising either. It doesn't really factor in France either, even though it is part of France technically. There are many explanations for this, I assume, and I think we'll talk about a few of them. But to your point, right? I think it's interesting. I think Martinique, for Anglophones specifically, maybe features mostly through giants of literature and thinking and decolonial thinking, which may be ironic, right? Considering Martinique is still part of France. But yeah, there's something to be said about that, maybe about exposure, generally speaking, and the place of the Caribbean at large. I mean, those islands specifically, since we have our guests today, maybe closer to those, but the Caribbean at large in the world, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think, I know this has been a theme for us this season or this month, is there an uptick in like Haitian studies, like scholars, collectives, reading groups, movies? I don't know. Is
I would
something happening, or is it just me noticing? I don't know. You tell me.
No, I'd say that's true, right? That there's been a lot of interest outside of Haitian studies circles and outside of Haiti. I mean, there are many, many popular podcasts for good and bad, focusing on the revolution. Very visible books have come out as well that sort of engage with that topic. And I think doesn't necessarily explain everything, but I personally tend to think part of the reason might be how people started looking into history, into theory around the Black Lives Matter movement. So the result, I think it can't be bad that we hear more about Haiti. I think it's also telling maybe that we end up mostly hearing, well, I mean, maybe that's not true. I don't have numbers, but no, yeah. I mean, I'd say all in all, I think it's a good thing. But
it's a good, yeah. I mean, anyway, I'm excited to welcome Marlene and Zaka, and we will do so in a minute. And I think my creds for this episode and then the next one on sports are like significantly lesser than yours. But I just want to say, I did do my PhD at the CUNY Graduate Center, and we did hang around Edouard Glisson. I've had some brushings with Edwidge Dantica. So, I'm cool.
Yeah.
But anyway, Marlene and Zaka coming up, but let's kind of see them for a second.
For salvation, running out the door of the old gas station. He makes it to the pump and say, "Don't ask no question. Quick, get into the car, we're heading for redemption."
Here is Zaka, and here is Marlene. Welcome, both of you. Greg, do you want to read a little bio of them as well?
I will read a little bio. And full disclosure, I have worked with both of these people fairly closely. So, if I'm being nice, that's probably part of the reason. All right. So Marlene Daut specializes in Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean, U.S. African American, and French colonial literary and historical studies. Her books include Baron de Vaté and the Origins of Black Atlantic Humanism, and Tropics of Haiti, Race and the Literary History of the Haitian Revolution in the Atlantic World. She is also co-editor of the volume Haitian Revolutionary Fictions, an anthology that apparently will come out on January 6, 2022. Her next book is an intellectual history of Haiti titled Awakening the Ashes, which is under contract with the University of North Carolina Press. Daut is the co-creator and co-editor of HNet Commons digital platform H80 and curates a website on early Haitian print culture at lagazetteroyale.com.
Wow, nice. I'll tell you what Zaka Toto is up to. Zaka Toto is the founder of Zist, a digital culture magazine based in Martinique. He is very much a writer covering current issues in post-colonial Martinique and generally the global zeitgeist, which he feels are heavily intertwined. He is also pursuing a PhD in history, researching liberation and independence movements in Martinique and Guadeloupe. And the mutations in the idea of nationalism in the last 60 years. That's amazing. He co-founded La Fabrique Decoloniale last year, an association aiming to further new ways to decolonize his country. A lot of local intensive activist work. He volunteers in the fields of civic and socio-economic empowerment through digital transformation. And then he spends half of his week, he says, working in the garden with his dad. So I had to say that, right?
Yeah, it's important. It's part of the work.
It is.
Welcome. Right. So do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Greg.
Okay. So we're talking about this in our banter. And, as I was saying, tend to speak of the Caribbean at this one place, and in many ways it is, right? I mean, it has a common history, intertwined history, certainly, also drastically different histories and experiences and languages and nations, right? Of course, we're talking, you have roots in Haiti, in Martinique, you live there, you live in the US, you're part of the diaspora from Marlene, very different experiences again. And so I'm curious, maybe we can start with this. What does the Caribbean mean for you as a place, as people, as an idea, and what makes it different, but possibly, or maybe not different, from the rest of this new world? Ladies first.
Ladies first, Haiti
Oh,
first.
oh,
Oh,
c'est original, ça. Okay. I would say the Caribbean. I would say, I mean, the first kind of word that came to mind was the word connection. And the second word was home, which is interesting because unlike Zaka, I have never lived in the Caribbean, although
Oh.
my family is from Haiti. But there's just a way in which I think the connections that we keep with Caribbean culture, specifically Haitian culture and history, just kind of having that presence and Haitian Creole in my life means that it still feels like, in some ways, a home that I'm kind of disconnected from, but also seeking connection with. And then I would say, what makes it different from the rest of the New World, so-called New World? I'm not exactly sure that it is, in the sense that it's part of that connection is with the two mainlands of North and South America. And the more that I learn about pre-Columbian society, which is a kind of particular teaching interest that I have. So I start with 5000 BCE with my students, and they're kind of like, whoa, what do we sign up for here? The more I learn about the migration patterns of people in the Caribbean and how they were also migrants from the mainland and among the islands themselves, the more I sort of think about how there isn't actually the whole entire hemisphere is in some ways an archipelago. It's just that the North and South American continents are enormous, and in the Caribbean, we're talking about much smaller land masses.
It's difficult to go after Marlene. So the question is again. Sorry, if I lost my.
The question is the Caribbean question.
The Caribbean. Well, for me, it's home. I actually grew up here. As many of the youngsters that grew up here, I had to leave at some point to my mainland, which is France, to further my studies. And then, I wasn't feeling very at home there, so I pushed myself a little bit further toward Asia. But in the sense of growing up in Martinique, rather than just talking about the Caribbean, there's also sometimes when you are some sense of the political situation, you can have a sense as well of exile within while living here. And I think you were talking earlier about paradoxes and the paradox of the Caribbean, of Martinique, of Haiti in general. Luxurious islands, tropical, very, very easy living, but at the same time, very, very hard to live in when you're from there. And it's something that you sometimes have to struggle with when you're there, when you're out there, because you miss home and you want to come back, but things are not easy. It's not a paradise per se. So we live with those contradictions. As for the Caribbean, for me, it's a set of mirrors. Taller, smaller, different influences, but with so many like commonalities, so many things in common, which can be really astounding. And also, I found out I lived in Asia for 10 years. I was in Taiwan and China, and I met many like South Americans. And what struck me a lot is the similarities between us. People from Central America, people from South America, and most of the time we were friends right away because we shared a lot of like cultural small stuff. So that's what it means for me.
yeah. I love the idea of the mirrors. That's really interesting. I'm I'll just push us into more specifics. So in kind of fleshing out this idea of the paradox, right? So if Marlene wants to comment on the fact that Haiti can be considered the first decolonized nation state, and then as kind of Greg said, it's been made to pay for it economically, politically, culturally in the last 200 years. So being that decolonized nation state, how can we think about its impact on its present? And then, to kind of ask Zaka something similar, is that Martinique has contributed some of the most widely read anti-colonial voices in the 20th century. Yet, the present, as you say, has not lived up to some of that grand history of thought. I don't know if Marlene wants to go first, Zaka, after.
Well, I guess we're gonna get real here. So, I mean, I guess I would say, is Haiti a decolonized state? Would be the first question, right? I mean, and I mean that in multiple realms, because we have a linguistic situation that the Haitian linguist Michel de Graaf calls linguistic apartheid, and that is where you have a majority population, of course, that speaks one language, Haitian Creole, and then you have a kind of I wouldn't even say it's just elite. You have a structure that's built in French, and that the French language remains. And so the literature, many laws, a lot of public discourse is conducted in French. And even when Haitian Creole exists alongside, because all Haitians also speak Haitian Creole, there is still this kind of dominance, and that the idea is that the language of official business is somehow still French, and the serious language is somehow still French. And although we are watching as that changes, I do think that it is indicative of an incomplete decolonization process. If I were to quote, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I would say that how do we decolonize our minds? And that's more difficult, because then it also involves, it's not just about neocolonialism, because I could have gone in a different direction with that. I could have talked about the United States, foreign interventions, but there's also capitalism, global capitalism. And the same global capitalism that is the support for the transatlantic slave trade is also behind factory work, is also behind industrialization, is also behind what we would like to think of as modernity. And so that is, to me, a more difficult question about also whether decolonization is actually possible and to what extent.
You're muted, Greg.
I feel that points to something that's also relevant to Martinique in this way, is that studying the history and the present of Haiti show that you can be on paper a decolonized nation state, right? I mean, a format that in and of itself is very beholden to European standards, right? But the system that you may or may not leave, and capitalism, as you say, I mean, it's a big term, but that's exactly what we're talking about. Will sort of define the terms of your decolonization, right? And so, yeah, I don't, Zaka, I don't know if you want to pick up the.
No, I find it very interesting. Because that's the question. The main issue here in Martinique is that basically, yes, we had those very brilliant thinkers and writers, and that somehow made us very important for our size. But we have our current political status, which is, we're still part of France. We're still a French region with some form of autonomy, though, since like 5 years ago. And keep pushing forward in that direction. Some kind of middle ground, I guess. And here, the issue is this deep-seated frustration about not having the aesthetics of decolonization. A flag, an anthem, and a proper football team, for example, that can actually play not with the French colors and not with the French flag. So it sometimes reduces what is decolonization to symbols, to very exterior symbols. I feel like, after the Second World War, when the independence movements were at their highest around the world, you had this very strong, dynamic here for 20, 30 years. I mean, from the 50s to the late 70s very seriously, and then some lingering movements, I think, at least until the beginning of the 1990s, and the people who were in power at that time also went through some of the disillusions of the first independent movement, of the first, independences. Sorry, and mainly in the case of Martinique and Guadeloupe, because there was this very central figure, not only intellectually but politically, that was Aimé Césaire. And even in Guadeloupe, there's this rivalry between the two islands in many ways. But in terms of like politics, before the war, after the war, he was supposed to be the father of the nation, of the nations, or at least the main, instigator. And he made this very conscious choice, I think, very difficult for him as well, to say, well, let's try to find, this kind of middle ground. And so for the last 50 years or so, we've been living with this middle ground, one step forward, one step backward. In terms of, economics, there's things have been kind of good, I guess. There's a lot of people who got, who got out of poverty. Our still, socioeconomic status is good, but at the same time, you have all those constraints of being part of France, of all of the barriers as well, not symbolic only, but very structural, that you have with your neighbors, with the other Caribbean islands, for example, with countries like North America and Latin America, that you cannot, operate, I guess, on your own because you're part of France. So who's deciding of, diplomacy, your economics, who are you, tying yourself with? It's going to be, the president of the French Republic, which is your president. You cannot do it on your own. So we're living in this middle ground, because, some decisions were made not to have, maybe because we felt that we could not win like a military fight against a global power. We actually, it's very small, only like 1,000 square kilometers. It's not so big. So this choice was made, and we're living with it. And I guess also saw what was happening with the post-independence, right? As in, is it me?
Not sure.
No, okay. As in, well, the Algerian independence that turned into like a military dictatorship. What happened to Lumumba, and then what came of Congo and Zaire. The very big in the Caribbean, and especially in Martinique, because there is this relationship with Haiti, which is both of total, complete admiration, and at the same time, it's been built in our heads, but also in our presentations, but also because we see Asian as migrants in Martinique, so as lesser people. I'm not saying they are. I think that's what some people feel like they are, because they work lower paid jobs. They mostly work in the countryside. They mostly work, agricultural work and everything. So we have this really weird relationship with Haiti, and you have to say that both the Duvalier years, and then what happened, there was this big hope in the early 90s, and then the multiple interventions and everything. That is at the same time, like, because we know that Haiti is the symbol of freedom in the Americas. And at the same time, we see what happens there, and we're scared.
Yeah. Two little things might lead us out. One, of course, what you're saying is the micro representational, like mistreatment issues that come between the various regions in the Caribbean. I just attended a presentation about Haitian literature, which was all about the horrible ways in which Dominicans are represented in it. So I think that's a very different topic, and we can come to it in a bit. I just wanted to.
That's not what I expected.
Dominicans?
Yeah.
I thought you were gonna see the horrible ways in which Haitians are represented in Dominican,
or treated in the Dominican Republic.
Absolutely, but I'm just saying that there is a constant, like a two-sided thing, and as you know, literature from the DR itself is a whole other. It's not here, compared to Haitian or whatever. anyway, I'm just coming off of that other thing, but I was thinking about the aesthetics and the symbolism and all that kind of things, Zaka, that you find it, you claim I think you're sort of saying that it becomes empty or hollow, these gestures, maybe monuments, maybe contemporary things. There's also a French president now who loves symbols and is always aiming for some symbolic, sort of elements in his leadership. So do you think that these symbolic things count to something, or do you feel that it's a waste of time? I mean, is there something you can pull from that and say, okay, actually we need the symbolic elements?
Should I start?
Anybody can answer.
Okay,
Marlene can.
okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess it's different. It's different in each place, in each in each country's struggle. You the thing about mirrors is that you look a little bit like each other, different size, you're distorted and everything. We share this kind of like same layers like throughout the Americas, right? We have all those like same layers who added themselves probably at the same time and produce like very different results, or very similar and very different at the same time results, right? That changes and then they interconnect with each other and everything. So it's a very complex dynamic. But then you actually have communities, national entities, and that went through their own very specific history and their trials and errors, and some of them went right away toward to political independence, and we have the flag, and we have the statues, and we have the forts, and we have everything. But then maybe we get smashed on other ways. Some actually went more toward like economic development. I'm thinking about, for example, the British Caribbean islands didn't really bother about maroons, and not so much like they didn't bother about decolonizing the UK symbol. There are courts where you had people with like the whole how do you, the whole British barrister decorum. It didn't bother them so much for 50 years or so, maybe because they felt like the priority was economic development, empowerment, and everything. And then you see a country that was part of the Commonwealth, and that was still part, for example, of the Commonwealth, that was a member of the Commonwealth, and the Queen was the head of state, like Barbados, for example, that decided 2021, okay, we're going to be a republic now. So there's those very different. And just this year, I think they removed the statue of I think it was what's the name of this very famous admiral, Nelson. There was this big statue of Nelson. They did a national ceremony about it last year, and they removed it, and then it's done. We didn't really bother about that much. I mean, there were probably movements, there were probably cultural movements, literary movements in the last 6 years or so that said, that's unacceptable, that's not, we shouldn't tolerate this, we should rename all the streets and put statues and everything. If I talk about Martinique, well, we did the opposite, right? We kept the French flag, we kept the French institution and structure, and somehow we tried to eat it from the inside a little bit, little by little, like throughout the decades. And at some point around the 80s, 90s, 2000s, we were actually somehow in some form of political autonomy, and not so bad, not full, but not so bad. And so we did the whole symbolic efforts, because for us, and that also sprouts from Césaire, change will come from the mind, from the culture, and everything else will follow, except so in the 90s, for example, in pretty much every city in Martinique, in roundabouts, you always have pretty much anywhere around the world, you have roundabouts, and then you put statues, symbols, what's the main crops of this city. In Martinique, we put statues of maroons. Maroons freeing themselves from chains, hands in the air with broken chains and everything. It's like 25 of them on the island. We have those very beautiful, very powerful monuments to it. But then last year, we felt like for a minute, the most crucial issue in Martinique was statues and the name of streets and everything. And despite the fact that we actually did that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, so then culture and symbolics become a thing in itself, and then maybe you forget, the material conditions of the people, and what's maybe the next step in the struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would just say on symbolism, I think that part of the reason the conversation is so tenuous in terms of what is the role of statues, what is the role of naming, what is the role of symbolism, is because there are certain, bad faith participants in the conversation who want everything to be who tried to frame things in a way where everything is the same, right? So that a statue of Toussaint Louverture is the same as a statue of Colbert, in the sense of, if you can have one, why can't you have the other one? Or that the people who are arguing that statues should come down are statues of racists, enslavers, eugenicists, people who commit genocide or argue for that we're saying we don't want any statues. And we could have a conversation also about whether we should have statues of anybody. What is the function of a statue and what should it do? But at the same time, but we can't have that conversation because we're busy having to fend off the people who then say, I'm going to take down this statue over here of Abraham Lincoln, and I'm going to take down this statue of Robert E. Lee, instead of saying, okay, but those are not the same thing, right? Because we're not asking for every single statue of we're asking for context. But if you live in the United States, for example, it is incongruous to have a statue of Robert E. Lee, who tried to destroy the United States. And so my work on Napoleon, that was the same feeling. So when people say, well, what about the statue of this and that? This kind of what about? But that wasn't the issue. Napoleon tried to destroy France, tried to destroy the French Republic. So why would anyone want to revere that and make an entire year devoted to it, which would be very similar to if we in the United States made a whole year of Robert E. Lee, at least to me. And so the question about whether we should have Jefferson statues, the question of whether we should have this statue, these are all conversations that we could have if we weren't busy arguing with people who want statues to some of the worst people who have ever lived, and so we're busy trying to get those down instead of having the conversation about what is the role and function of the statue. And I know that there are plenty of scholarly circles in which we can talk about those things and do, but it is in the public sphere, it seems like you're either for or you're against. And I think, obviously, we all know that the situation is much more complicated than that. And there are plenty of people who've devoted their scholarly lives to thinking about these questions. And those are the people that I think we want to push into public discourse. But in terms of Haiti, there's lots of statues in Haiti. And this is, again, but they're not statues to Duvalier. They're not statues to Duvalier. They threw the Columbus statue into the sea. They're statues to Toussaint Louverture. And again, if we could have a conversation about Toussaint's life and all, but you could never put Toussaint Louverture, any ill he's ever done, on par with Robert E. Lee or Napoleon. So that's what I mean when I say we're not all in the same conversation when we're talking about statues.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing is, like, I felt for me from the point of view from here, that it got superimposed with a very American condition of the symbolics of those statues, and like the mapping of those statues, and the very intention of those statues in the US, in the South, why they were there. They were there not during the time of slavery. They were not put there during the war, for example, like during the Civil War. They were put there much after, even like during the 60s, to remind people that it's still, you're still in it. And so while for example, the statue of Josephine in Martinique, so Josephine, she's a colonial from a white colonial from Martinique, was the Empress of the France, the wife of Napoleon. I think there's a movie coming, and a statue. The head of the statue was, so it's on the main side, which is just in front of me right now, and so on the main plaza in the capital city of Martinique, Fort-de-France, and the statue was beheaded 3 years ago, and there was blood poured 3 years ago. I think it was 1991, and just in front of this statue, you have which used to be the colonial governor palace. Just next to it, you have the police forces, the national police forces. And the statue was owned by actually the city of Fort-de-France. And the mayor at the time was. And
oh, we lost. Okay, Zaka, we lost
sorry.
you.
Yeah, sorry. Terrible problems. It was left as is for 30 years. Like, and last year, so I guess in terms of symbolic, the power, because the statue was put there to remind people of something very intentionally, because it was built, during the nephew, Napoleon III, like 30 years, like 70 years after Napoleon. It was put there to remind people of the everlasting bond between France and Martinique, the old colonies, as they call it. It was there to remind people that this bond will never be broken. So that 100 years later, you beheaded and there's blood poured on it means the nature of the relationship has changed. The fact that nobody did anything to restore it, that actually it was classified as a French national historic monument like this, beheaded with blood on it, means that somehow something changed during that time, right? So the power of the statue, the fact that it was meant to symbolize, domination and colonial, and colonial power, was removed. It was desacralized. It was maybe not entirely destroyed, but beheaded, literally beheaded. So then, what's the need for it 30 years later to actually destroy it? This is like, it's like taking the head of something in a very, military way. You have this prize. This is our prize. This is the symbol that actually we are actors. We are actors of our own emancipation, and you erase it. And the second thing is, when it was destroyed, the police forces were next to the militants who were destroying it, right? They were next to it. And they were looking, I was there, they were looking with a smile on their face. And that's the very tension that I've been living through in the last 3-4 years or so.
So just for context,
About
I think,
symbols and everything.
mentioning, in case, I don't know if everybody knows this, but about a week, or was it like in May 2020, a small group of activists in Martinique first toppled the statue of Victor Schœlcher, who's an abolitionist, contributed to the second French abolition of slavery in 1848, but eventually also took down the statues of Joséphine and of Denambuc, the French Columbus, I guess. But so, I think what you both brought up here, and that I think also connects with the question that I saw Alex put in on Facebook or somewhere. The matter of focus matters here, huh? and I think Zaka earlier you were saying there's a way we can see those actions in the cultural realm, maybe taking attention away from potential actions in the economic realm, the social realm. The ways in which the symbolic actions maybe not prevent us, but again take energy away from other types of action. I think by the same token, Alex was asking, well, whose focus are we talking about? There's a way in which we can easily dismiss cultural work, and yet, what I hear when I hear both of you talking about this is just how crucial historical knowledge is for all of this. So you both work in historical studies. I'm just wondering where do you see that work fitting in the moment, right? In both places, and also maybe in the light of what's been going on both in Martinique and Haiti lately.
I mean, I would say, I think, what I tell my students is that, statues and monuments are at the service of people, not the other way around. It's not our job to prevent them from being destroyed by the elements, which, like Henri Christophe's famous palace at Sanssouci, partially destroyed by an 1842 earthquake in the northern part of Haiti, or the Louis XVI hand during the George Floyd protests. A protester inadvertently, it seems from the video, is like pulling on the hand and it comes off. And maybe that now the statue has a new history. And as Zaka was discussing, the Josephine statue gained a new history. But of course, from the historical standpoint, we see statues and monuments come down all the time. That's the reason that the Louis XVI statue was in Louisville in the first place, was because it had been removed by various French governments and shipped overseas and held in storage, put up, taken down. It has a history. Yeah. And so I would say, in terms of the question about if we're focusing on that, does it mean we're not focusing on some other social or political issue? I think that if that were the case, we wouldn't see such major attention being devoted to it, because it's kind of all folded in. I mean, as Zaka mentioned, when you think about Confederate statues and when they went up in a particular moment in time to basically say, no, white supremacy is here to stay. The Ku Klux Klan is here to stay. The Daughters of the Confederacy are more powerful than whatever civil rights organizations that you would like to create to propagate voting rights, to do all these things. They're there to remind. And so then and they're there to remind of a political sphere in which certain people are not supposed to have access. Because if you put up a Confederate statue to Robert E. Lee in a Black community where there's a lot, like Charlottesville, then you're sending a message to the Black inhabitants of this city, many of them descended from enslaved peoples. You're sending them a message about what their rights are going to be. Then it makes it easier to, and sorry, we so in the weeds for those of you who are familiar with Charlottesville's history, but there's a region called Vinegar Hill, which was an African-American community. It was raised, historically speaking, to kind of create this commercial center for the city. And this is a big part of the city's history, that this community was taken away largely without the consent of, and all the things that happen when governments do things like this. And so in that light, you can see the ardent fight over which people lost their lives a few years ago, here in August of 2017, for a statue. Then it's, to me, impossible to say that. And we needed legislation to take them down. We had to change the laws of our state. The laws of our state had to be changed in order to remove that statue and the much larger one that got less attention in Richmond. So and because those things actually, I do think, are related to the socioeconomic status of people of color, especially many African Americans who have consistently pushed out of Charlottesville by gentrification, as we watch multiple hotels go up, but not affordable housing. And so that a lot of the people who are laboring people in the city now have to live further and further out and commute in because they can't afford to live here. So to me, they're not the same, but it isn't to suggest that focusing on one means you wouldn't focus on the other, because as long as we have to pass by all of these statues every day, these monuments, they're infiltrated into our school system. They're in our consciousness, and maybe they do make us a little bit less willing to confront other histories and policies. And now we have a legislature that is saying, no, we're gonna actually address some of these things, and now we need to push them to address fair housing, voting rights, and make sure we continue to protect that here in Virginia, but across the United States more broadly.
All right. So just to be sure, don't get me wrong. I'm not against the destruction of statues. I really don't care about statues actually in general, which is not true as well. But it's kind of it's like the Schrodinger's cat, right? So it's important and it's not important. You see what I mean? And I guess what I'm trying to say is depending on where this problem is and what is the the current moment of this very particular struggle in that very particular community makes it make sense. And of course, it's not for us to decide if it makes sense or not. We have to figure out maybe what it means and what are the dynamics involved and everything. And of course, decolonization is definitely something that is multi-pronged, right? It's multiple actions in all sorts of domains at the same time that you have to pursue. And different communities or maybe different people will feel like, this is the priority or this is not the priority. To me, the way things concern in Martinique in the last 1 or 2 decades or so, around culture, about renaming things, about flags and anthems and everything, is that we made decolonization entirely about this, and we forgot about everything else. Empowerment, schools, health, actually, how people live together. We basically, the island is people are desocializing themselves even before like the pandemic happened. We have a huge problem, which is pretty much like every developing country. We have massive exodus of people every year. We lose around 1 to 2% of our population every year for the last decade. Has it been addressed? No, but we're talking about statues. Do you see where I'm going with this? So this is very specific to where I'm from. When I started to write about statues 4 years ago, when the events happened in Charlottesville. Actually, before that, but it was not so good. Don't look for it. It was mid 2000s. Forget it. And for me, what was interesting was so I just came back to Martinique at that time, 2017, just a year before. I was in Taiwan, which has a very colonial history, actually, like multiple colonial history, one after the other, and still kind of live within it because there's this very specific relationship with China and Japan and the US, and within the society as well. And 30 years ago, there were dictatorship by, Chinese mainlanders, people from China who fled the civil war after losing the civil war against Mao. Sorry, I won't be too long. And came to Taiwan and took power, and put there by the United States, maintained there and everything. And 30 years ago, military state, a curfew every night, and there's different type of people that have different types of rights. And everywhere, like in every dictatorship, there's statues of dictators, of celebrating Chiang Kai-shek and his son. And for the last 20 years or so, somehow the state is not independent because it's not recognized by enough countries, but it's independent de facto because it is independent. They have their own flag, which is still the colonial flag. They have their own money. They do their own, they have different passports and everything. And what they did with the statue of Chiang Kai-shek was they just put them all in a park, and it's kind of done.
Mm-hmm.
So I come back here, and I meet the people from my age, I meet younger people, and everything is about flags and the guy was at the head of the region at the time, had the very genius idea of doing a national consultation to have a very specific flag and a very specific anthem in Martinique. And we have an historic nationalistic flag that has been debated very much, because it's the symbols of like independence. This is independence, and not everybody is for independence in Martinique. So it was loved and hated, and people were like in between. And so there's this consultation, and actually this started the thing because the flag was ugly. Let's put it this way: the flag that was chosen was ugly, and then you have this generation who said, well, we were not in the fights in the 70s, but this is our flag, the nationalistic flag. This is our flag, and this is the only flag that we should ever put, everywhere. So this is the thing that started all the militant movement. But it stayed there. We kept talking about symbols. But, we didn't take care of all the other issues that maybe are structurally, maybe not symbolically as important, maybe not in your mind because it's not the thing that you see, but that are actually the enablers of, empowerment.
But I'm looking at Alex Phil's question here. It says, are there really no people, organizations working on housing, climate, etc.? And of course, I know the answer, but I'm curious to hear you about this. Of course, there are organizations working. Martinique is facing serious issues with chlordécone or Capone, I think Americans know that. Haiti is facing all sorts of issues also, both having to do with climate change, social, international intervention, et cetera. So, we talk a lot about decolonization, and whatever that might mean. What do you think, what does it mean, as far as those types of organizations are concerned in both Like what is actually happening once we toss the statues in the sea?
But I mean, I would say just taking the example of Haitians throwing the Columbus statue into the sea in the context of the rebellion against Jean-Claude Duvalier and the Duvalier regime. So it is true that we need to talk about both things, which is the end of a dictatorship there, the creation of the attempt to create a democracy, all of these. But I think that the reason that we get distracted, if we want to use that word, in the United States is because they are indelibly intertwined. And so if Haitians, for example, had to be debating and talking about statues, then that would distract them from the fact that we need to be talking about elections, we need to be talking about potable water, and we need to be talking about infrastructure so that when another earthquake hits, because Haiti's on 2 gigantic fault lines, there are going to be earthquakes, that the infrastructure is there, because it is only a disaster, an earthquake, when it meets an infrastructure not capable of withstanding its force, right? And so this is what we have seen over and over again in Haiti. And what I would say is the difference there is that I'm from California. I was born in California. Ever since I can remember, people were talking about the big one. We've seen a lot of big ones, San Francisco, Northridge, in my lifetime. But the difference is then the building codes come, the rebuilding effort is built to withstand. You cannot build a brick house anymore in California because bricks cannot withstand earthquakes. So these are the conversations that we need to be having. But let me also say, Haitians having conversations about patrimony. They are consistently talking about the founding of their country and which of the figures, Dessalines, Christophe, Toussaint Louverture, Pétion, etc., are the most sort of representative of the future direction of the country. So I don't want to say that these are separate issues. I actually want to say that different people need to be focusing on different realms, because that to me is like saying, don't focus on voting rights because we need to focus on the threat that the US Supreme Court right now is posing to abortion rights. Well, no, actually. What we need are many groups of people actually tackling all of these social issues and problems at the same time. But it is also true that there are certain elements of white supremacy that are meant to distract us and throw us off our course. But I don't think a debate about statues is one of them. I think because if it weren't also so indelibly involved in the school system, which is something I didn't understand until I lived in the South, and I also understand this in the Haitian context in terms of how history is taught, and then especially in the French context of metropolitan France, if it didn't involve the indoctrination of people's minds to make them less sensitive to questions of housing and voting rights and all of these other things we care so much about, then things might be different. But it is part of that indoctrination. Walking among tyrants in your city is a part of the indoctrination that will make you think it's not my problem that person over there is homeless, when that is a structural problem and a failure of a society to have individuals who don't have proper care and the things they need to survive. And that is something that Haitians know very, very well and know is indelibly linked to all of the other questions of symbolism and that we're talking about as well.
Yeah. I mean, here the schools are named Aimé Césaire, Paulette Narda, Edouard Glissant, France Fanon. I mean, my like militants in the 70s made a high school, one of the biggest high school named.
No, I lost him.
Oh shit.
It's okay. Greg, do you want to ask another question and then he can resume when he resumes?
So,
he's back.
Is he?
I don't know. Let's give him a few minutes and we can come back.
Sorry. Where did it cut?
I don't. It's not right at the beginning, Zaka. But maybe we should take. I think you were saying something that connects to what Laurie Bay is asking, which is how do you explain the fact that the new generation is not aware what has been done before? Though you started off by saying something about the curriculum of hyper awareness, perhaps. I don't know.
So it's very strange that in an era where you can know everything, you have younger generations that almost forget. So from my understanding, and I'm not trying to impose like this is what happened, but from my understanding is like at some point you rename the school, you do the work, you do the cultural work, you put those statues in the roundabouts, and you do all those things, and then they kind of become absent, or you don't see them anymore. It's in the background. It's in the background. Once you remove the tyrants and you put your heroes and you put all the things that are yours, then it becomes the background. It becomes the natural background, and you don't feel the need to explain it to every generation after generation. Or maybe we do a bad job, and that might be the main explanation. We did a bad job of transmitting those legacies. A very bad job. The main example for me was last year. So as we said, like for 4 months more or less, from May to August, many monuments, like the name of streets, were removed, and plaques and everything, and statues were destroyed. But at some point, one of the monuments that was almost about to be attacked was the gate of the Tricentennial. Also in Fort-de-France. It was built in 1935 to celebrate 300 years of the French Empire. That started here in Martinique, the first colony. The first colony, of the empire. Yeah. So 300 years, right? And so this is a colonial monument, right? This is something that was created at the time of the Universal and the Colonial exhibition in Paris. So this is something that has a very strong and meaningful, symbol. But then, so Aimé Césaire became mayor in 45 of Fort-de-France. So this gate, and there was a military caserne also within it, became, the domain of the city. And so what it did for starting in the 70s is it built a cultural center there within the gate in the park, with almost like free education within it. Like you could do pretty much anything. The idea was to build a new generations of writers, of cinematographers, of painters, of dancers, and it was done with almost no money. Like the city of Fort-de-France is a poor city, and has been for a long time. So it did that. And then he made a guy who was an artist that was very strongly associated, who actually went to jail for that, was very strongly associated with the nationalistic movement in Martinique, with the independentist movement in Martinique. And people were willing like to throw bombs and stuff. And so this guy named Coco Manikourai became an artist, and Césaire made him, or Coco pretty much decided to paint a Native American, like Curry Revolution, killing, colonial settlers all around the gate. So the gate is not anymore the Tricentennial Gate, right? It's not celebrating anymore 300 years of French colonization. It means something very much different. It has a sense of empowerment, right? There's layers to it. But still, because there was nothing there that were explained to younger generation, during the fever of summer last year, they were actually going to attack they were actually going to attack the gate, and even like the fresco that was on it. And what happened was like, so I got a call in the middle of it. Someone called me and told me, Zaka, give me a reason to stop give me a reason to stop them. Let's explain what I just explained to you. So I guess the work is, and the sense of the work, and that was the previous question as well. What is the sense of what we do? Maybe as historians, our people are trying to mix, research and militancy, and trying to educate people. Is that we can show that some things have been done already, and maybe we can move on to the next.
You're muted.
Yeah, I wondered if the interference was from here, but maybe not. Just to shift the question, though we've already mentioned some of this, just to talk a tiny bit about what people assume are natural disasters. We know they're not natural, where earthquakes, hurricanes, and of course, coming out of my own kind of, fields of African studies and so on, you're thinking about these famines, none of them are natural. So I just wondered if both of you wanted to comment on, yes, the human responsibility, but also like colonial history in the moment now we are in the Caribbean, which is on the front line of these kind of hazards, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say on the front line of climate change as well. And so this is a repeating pattern, you know, if we think of the sort of the repeating island of Benitez Rojo, but part of it also means that the disasters that affect one place will be then repeated. It will come out differently and affect. We aren't talking about it as much, but the various smaller islands in the Caribbean, I think it was 2 years ago, that virtually just kind of decimated and destroyed by the same hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. And we heard a lot about that for a while, and then it falls out of the news. Or earlier than that, there was Hurricane Matthew in Haiti. There was also tropical storm. This is actually, these are things that affect each Caribbean island as a copy of the other one, but a copy with a slight, so the mirror again, but a slight difference and slight distortion depending on the kind of infrastructure and depending on the particular landscape and history of colonization and the government structure. Are you still a part of the Commonwealth, or are you completely independent? I mean, all of these things will matter in terms of how the quote unquote natural disaster will affect an area or climate change, and what will happen afterwards.
Right.
And what will happen afterwards. Because what we saw in the United States is Hurricane Maria with Puerto Rico, a long, unconscionably long recovery that actually has a lot to do with Puerto Rico's status as a territory, not as a state, as a kind of de facto quasi-colony. And then we see that actually, the big might and power can't protect you from a natural disaster and can't even speed up the recovery. And the recovery there, I do think, is markedly different from what we saw with Hurricane Katrina, which was also its other entire disaster in a different way. And Louisiana and New Orleans, of course, being intimately connected to the Caribbean as a notion, as a geopolitical space, but also if we think of that kind of archipelagic way of thinking, connected there as well in terms of trade routes and colonial history, and even the contemporary history, especially migratory patterns and culturally. So I would say that the people of the Caribbean and the people of the Gulf Coast, who are sort of, and Florida as well, are at the front of this, a new era of disasters that's going to include all the old disasters and ones we probably can't even imagine as of yet. And they are experiencing them in these massive hurricanes that are the sizes of several football fields or the entire state of Michigan, as the estimates are saying. And soon enough, as Caribbean history became the dominant, the slavery that was in the Caribbean first became the dominant form of commerce on the mainlands, I think also we're going to see that. It's going to start in the Caribbean, climate change, the disastrous effects of it, and it's going to move in the mainlands, and no one will be untouched by it, which is the same as the histories of slavery and colonialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Zaka, you want to comment, or should we go to Greg's musical?
No, just very quickly. I think it's very important right now to build, link within different Caribbean countries and different, mainlands or different, sphere of influences. Sorry, at least at first within the civil society, but I think that's a very important way to bend. Maybe our dependency on one sphere of influence, and to figure out solutions actually within us.
Figure out solutions within us.
Within communities that are intricately linked, actually. So that's all I have to say about natural disasters. We can build our own infrastructures if we put ourselves together.
Okay. We're not going to argue with that. There is some argument to be made, but we are sort of out of time. We're trying to be timely this year, and so Greg has some music to decolonize our ears, and so let's go for it.
So all right, so I'm gonna go back in time as we start with the more recent and go backwards. I will start with a topic we did not talk about because we can't talk about everything. And a musician, Herb Black, Calypsonian from St. Lucia. So he was born in Ancillary, a small fisherman village there. Started singing in the mid-'80s, and especially notable because at that time, not many working class Rastafarian French Creole speaking singers were famous in Calypso. The genre at that time was mostly from fairly well-to-do English-speaking singers. His sister is also fairly well known as Black Pearl. She's also as a French singer. They performed together as the Blacks. He's been a staple of the St. Lucia scene, having won several monarch crowns at Carnival along the years. His songs often bear on political topics. And last year, for example, he released a song called Quarantine, where he gave instructions for distanciation and other typical subjects. The song I'm playing is from 2014. The title, I think, makes clear what the song's about. It's called Reparation. And here it comes.
Let's look at the beneficiaries of one of the world's worst human atrocities. Was started by the Vatican, continued by the Europeans. It was one great triangle shipping slaves out of the motherland. Now they are wealthy because of us. Oh yes, all we gained was the sign of the cross. How much will they compensate? When will blacks repatriate? How long must the black man wait to get reparation now? Tell me, no, I'm not a West Indian.
I can never play the whole song, but that would be good. You can find it on YouTube like most things. All right, back in time to Mano Charlemagne, who I may not need to introduce. Anyway, he was born in California, Port-au-Prince in the late 40s. He started his musical career singing in church, but became interested in the music of rural workers coming to work in the city. And started emulating and promoting that style in an artistic group called Culture et Liberté. An opponent to dictator Jean-Claude Duvalier, he had to leave the country in the face of death threats, coming back right after his fall in 1986. Charlemagne remained an important figure of protest on the island, narrowly escaping assassination attempts, and once again having to leave the country after being imprisoned by dictator Raoul Cedras after he overthrew the first Aristide government in 1991. When he returned from exile, he served for a few years as mayor of Port-au-Prince. When he came back from 95 to 99, he wasn't very fond of that experience and eventually moved to Florida, where he died in 2017. The song I'm playing today is Pour qui ça au papa les mamans, about the silent ache of a mother. This is from his 1988 album. And here it comes.
Pour qui sont papa les mamans, pour qui toutes ces graisses à maman, misère pas de me faire cœur content. Misère ça qui me moule la tripe, souffrance cap c'est pour l'ombri pour résister, compliment. Pour qui sont papa les mamans, pour qui toutes ces graisses à maman, misère pas de me faire cœur content. Misère ça qui me moule la tripe, souffrance cap c'est pour l'ombri pour résister, compliment.
All right, and last but not least, fairly fitting for today's conversation, as it turns out. I did not do this on purpose. Yeah, I did. Joe Desormeaux. Zaka recently posted a string of tweets about him as he died, I think 2 weeks ago. So go check it out. This is a homage. He worked on, he's from Martinique. He worked on banana plantations in the 50s and 60s before doing his military service in France. On coming back from France, he lived for a time in Guadeloupe, where he was witness to the massacre of workers on strike by the French police in May 1967. Following this, he started making music in the early 70s, becoming famous for songs produced for Carnival, and whose music contests he won several times in sometimes controversial circumstances. Songs were very politically minded or bad-mannered, as he called them, and at that time that often meant that they would not play them on the radio. He wrote about current politics, but also Martinican history, notably about the uprisings of May 1848 or uprising of September 1870. The song I chose today is from 1978. It's a begin. I like begin, so that's my choice. It's about a certain Josephine, who you may have heard about. And if I did everything right, this is right before it tells us that one day we'll throw it in the ocean. Call that prophecy.
E nous sommes un jour arrivé, nous qu'à jeter dans l'océan. Et nous qu'a dit pour nous pour passer, nous pas en fond comme pour bonnement. Et nous sommes bien un jour arrivé, nous qu'à jeter dans l'océan. Et nous qu'a dit pour nous pour passer, nous pas en fond comme pour bonnement.
Too bad you can't see the cover of the album because he's got his arms up with broken chains, which also reminds me of the discussion about the statues at roundabouts, the living statue at a roundabout. All right, that's it. I'm done with music.
Yeah, okay. Well, huge thanks to Marlene, huge thanks to Zaka. That was fun. That felt a bit short. Of course, how can it not? But next week is our last and final episode, which is titled War minus the shootouts. Am I right? And we're gonna, and it's going to be about sports. Though I think, Greg, you only want to talk about football. We'll see. But
If I may say, Joe Desormeaux was a goalie apparently, so I'll just put that out there. That's a perfect transition.
Wow.
Yeah.
We have Sean Jacobs and Shireen Ahmed, and it's going to be an exciting finale. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you, Zaka. I will end now. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.